Welcome, everyone, to our final keynote for the 2024 Call to Action to Change Child Welfare Conference. I am particularly delighted to introduce a colleague and a friend of, I think, almost 33 decades now, which I know dates us, but I know we look like we're about 25 each. There's a lot of conversation about poverty, neglect, and maltreatment. And Claire and her colleagues' work over at Chapin Hall is, bar none, probably the most comprehensive look that we can do into this really complex topic. So I'm going to turn it over to Claire, and I encourage you to put comments in the chat and ask any questions that you may have, and we'll get started now.
Wonderful. Lisa, thank you so much. This is more than a delight to be here with you in particular and with everyone that's joining us. I am going to share my screen and get my slides up. It's going to take just a second to transition into a slideshow, but we are going to have a very fast-paced discussion about the evidence of economic and concrete supports. I know I think, build this as uncoupling poverty, neglect, and abuse, and I'm going to turn that a little bit on its head in a moment. We will go super fast. I've included a little QR code here because we have much of this research and tools and other evidence and information on our website. So feel free to go there and download all of this material, and certainly we'll make this slide deck that's for today specifically available to you as well. So let's just get started. And the place that I really like to start is what families say and family voice. Families have been very clear with our nation for literally decades about what they need to keep their children safe and for their families to be stable and thrive. On the left-hand side of this slide deck, we see the Birth Parent National Network and Casey Family Programs Parent Advisory Committee explaining to us in a very clear logic model that policies and strategies that redress poverty and meet basic needs are fundamental to creating a 21st century child and family well-being system and keeping kids safe. And on the right-hand side of this slide, you see a little study, qualitative study from Chapin Hall in 2008. Andy Zinn and colleagues at that time surveyed parents receiving in-home preservation services and the caseworkers who were supporting them, and found, quote, an intriguing, unquote, difference, a disagreement about what services and supports are most helpful. It's not a surprise, however, that even though families tell us repeatedly what they need, that our policy framework in many ways does just the opposite at every opportunity. It uncouples concrete supports from social supports. At the very beginning, when mothers' pensions and the Social Security Act were pulling together to create the beginnings of the system that we have now, concrete supports were separated from social supports, even though mothers were saying they needed both. And most recently, our Family First Prevention Services Act included explicitly mental health, substance abuse, and parenting interventions, and disregarded and eliminated economic and concrete supports from that act. So we continue to uncouple concrete and social supports in our policy framework. And yet we have, in addition to family voice and qualitative information, we have about 40 years of combined quantitative and qualitative information that helps us understand that when economic and concrete supports are reduced in lives of families, there's an increased risk of maltreatment and child welfare system involvement. And conversely, when economic and concrete supports are increased, we see a decreased risk of child maltreatment and child welfare system involvement. We see that across time, across different kinds of studies, from randomized controlled trials, just a few of those, to natural experiments, administrative data analyses. And we see it pretty consistently across mechanisms as well, whether it's cash, childcare, housing, healthcare, employment. And certainly this information is policy actionable, even though we have thus far uncoupled economic and concrete supports and social supports in the child welfare context. I want us to take a minute, even though I'm already going very fast, to pause and to understand that we talk a lot about poverty and neglect, or that we're conflating them. And while I think that does happen, I want to be clear that something far more complex and nuanced is occurring, because we are seeing this effect across child welfare outcomes and maltreatment types. So on child welfare outcomes, if economic and concrete supports are increased or decreased, we see a relationship with either increased or decreased referrals, investigations, substantiations, entry into foster care, and time to reunification. So this presumably is not just low-risk families for whom something is occurring and someone is mistakenly making a referral to child welfare. That certainly occurs. But presumably, this is also families with very complex needs where a true child safety crisis is occurring and entry into foster care has occurred. So we're seeing economic and concrete supports have an effect at all of these decision points. We're also seeing economic and concrete supports having an effect at all maltreatment types: neglect, abuse, abusive head trauma for young children, and fatalities. So if we hear that economic and concrete supports alone cannot predict child maltreatment or affect child maltreatment, I think the evidence is more nuanced and complex than that. We've also recently conducted a systematic review of economic and concrete supports to prevent child maltreatment, and we looked specifically, really solely, at randomized control trials and quasi-experimental design studies. And we found consistent, favorable evidence of the impact of economic and concrete support as a prevention strategy to reduce maltreatment and child welfare entry. So then zooming back out to the policy context from the evidence for a moment, we certainly have economic hardship in this country and a fragmented human service system that has repeatedly uncoupled concrete supports from social supports. And when the support is designed specifically to address like health needs like Medicaid or self-sufficiency like TANF, even those are sort of disjointed from each other, and they have deficit-based and piecemeal eligibility criteria and administrative requirements. We overlay on top of that mandated reporting laws and disparate access to resources for families of color or particular families. And what we think is happening is that this is resulting in overloaded and destabilized families, a high degree of unmet service needs, and then reports specifically or more predominantly for neglect. And then the activation and deployment of the government's authority to investigate and remove children. And then longstanding child welfare system involvement. And we have historically conceptualized this activation and deployment of this governmental authority as it relates to a parent or a caregiver doing something wrong to bad to a child, abusing or neglecting a child, and not fully interrogating the entirety of our policy choices. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. We think that there may be a different framework that could help us reconceptualize when and how to use that child protection function for true child safety needs that are imminent. And this would include looking at our macroeconomic policy context, creating cross-sector shared responsibility and accountability for preventing the activation and deployment of CPS and the use of foster care, and mandated supporting in addition to or in a more nuanced way alongside mandated reporting. This Meeting Family Needs Framework that we've just published from Chapin Hall gives us beginning outlines of this. We'd love feedback on where and how that you all believe that this framework could begin to address these more structural and financing considerations across sectors and at the macroeconomic context. It's important to note this isn't just Chapin Hall taking a look at the evidence and coming to this conclusion. We see many organizations and researchers really sort of poking away at what's a different set of mechanisms that we could use to address our set of challenges. You see the Centers for Disease Control here in 2019, calling for a strengthening of economic supports for families, a multi-generational strategy to strengthen household financial security to prevent ACEs, including increasing economic stability and family income, increasing maternal employment, improving parents' ability to meet basic needs, childcare, reducing stress and depression, and ensuring that families are able to care for sick family members. And as you all know, 5 of the 10 adverse childhood experiences relate to child abuse and neglect. So let's look at an overview of the intersection of economic security, insecurity, income, and child welfare system involvement. It's really important to understand that 83% of families who are investigated by Child Protective Services have incomes below 200% of the federal poverty line. We are predominantly pointing this activation deployment of CPS at poor families. Oh, and I'm not able to advance my slide. Hold on just a second. Let me pull out of this and see if I can, there we go. I'm gonna go back to the slide I was on and play from current slide. Apologies for there we go. 60% of investigated CPS substantiations involve neglect only, but as I made the point earlier, it's important to note that whatever is in this box, which includes substance use, mental health challenges, domestic violence, we know is in this box. Economic and concrete supports seem to be having an effect. And this relates not only to abuse and neglect, and we'll see that laid out a little more clearly in a few studies. I also want us to be really curious about this new study from Kempe and Drake that looked at the relationship between child poverty rates and child maltreatment reporting rates at the county level. They find that that relationship has intensified by almost 40% between 2009 and 2018. And one hypothesis they put forth is that as income equality is growing, that something might be happening that we don't fully understand in that space for families who are poor. And they recommend 2 core approaches, including building policies and practices to reduce the level of economic hardship for families in general, and reorienting human services to recognize the core and expanding importance of poverty as a fundamental threat to human functioning. I think this helps us to understand why a cross-sector shared responsibility and accountability framework is needed, that there's a whole of government, a whole of macroeconomic, and a whole of child welfare strategy going forward, rather than thinking solely about transforming the child welfare system. So as we look at this relationship with poverty and child welfare reporting and involvement, we get curious about the policy choices that states are making. And I'm going to toggle back and forth with some of the state options and choices that are available. And here we see that nearly half of all states do not exempt families' financial ability to provide from their definition of neglect. Some do, some don't. But to the extent that you all are interfacing at the state level, these are the kinds of questions or curiosities relative to the evidence that are important. We do also see the federal government elevating that it is a choice to exempt or not poverty and financial ability to care for a child in the definition of child abuse and neglect. And there's been a recent update to the Child Welfare Policy Manual at 2.3. Question 5, can states have a definition of child abuse and neglect that excludes symptoms of poverty or failure to provide for material needs due to economic instability? And there's a very long answer, and I would encourage you to go and read all the nuance, but fundamentally, the answer is yes. We see states beginning to change. In addition to the 50 or so that already have exemptions, we do see new states beginning to change their definitions. Washington State just changed its definition in 2021 and Kentucky in 2022. Kentucky is actually really interesting insofar as it says when financially able to do so or offered financial or other means to care for, provide food for, clothing, shelter, education, or medical care necessary to keep a child safe at home. So this sort of previews the potential of a state saying, we're on the hook for providing some degree of financial support. And then we look at intent. So let's look at some of the drivers that we think are at play here. We start with a theoretical model, looking at the family stress model, that economic and material hardship mechanistically through high cognitive loads, drained mental resources, increased conflict, less nurturing and responsive parenting, and then a higher risk for child welfare involvement. I actually was talking to somebody this week who had spent time in foster care, or her sibling had spent time in foster care, I'm sorry. And she said, she made this very clear. She said, it always seemed when we were trying to get benefits or supports that we were standing in the wrong line. I think we've all had that experience one time or another. And when your cognitive load is already high, standing in the wrong line to get additional supports and services to stabilize your family can feel overwhelming. So what should we be looking for when people are standing in the line, or when we're working and supporting families upstream? On the right-hand side of this slide, we see the strongest predictors of investigated neglect reports: food insecurity, housing insecurity, utility shutoffs, not being able to get medical care for a sick child or family member, and public benefit receipt. This public benefit receipt, I think here you'll actually see that it's highly buffering and protective. My hypothesis here is it might be a spotlight effect with more mandated reporters in the lives of families. On the left-hand side of the slide, we see the most reliable economic predictors of child welfare involvement: income loss, cumulative material hardship, and housing hardship. This is those same boxes that we were just looking at, visually depicted as the overloaded truck metaphor, which frameworks, I think, helpfully gave to us. As we put those additional boxes, or those additional boxes become placed on the truck, it doesn't operate as designed. Anyone knows if you put 10,000 pounds on a truck that has a payload of 5,000 pounds, it does not operate as intended. And we see that quite clear here. It's important to understand that this relationship we've known for a while, but we have a growing evidence base that there's a causal relationship between poverty and child welfare system involvement. We see researchers helping us to get much clearer that the impacts of poverty on child welfare involvement are large in scale. They're influenced significantly by the depth and duration of poverty, and both the type and quantity of economic insecurities do impact child maltreatment. And that our research base, this preponderance of evidence that we have, helps us to understand that child protection practices need to move away from a narrow focus on parental risk in the harmful context. That there is a much broader context here to take in play. So as we're looking at causal evidence, this is probably the most important study that I'll elevate today, in my opinion. This is a randomized controlled trial. It happened to be using a sort of a very clear experiment where mothers were participating in TANF, but the state had a waiver to pass administrative dollars that would normally, under business as usual, go to the state, pass those dollars to the mother. And that money would be disregarded in determining welfare benefits. So the technicals are, there's a randomized controlled trial. Some moms got more money and some moms got business as usual, which was less money. The moms who got more money were 10% less likely to have a child subject to a screened-in maltreatment report, and even a modest increase in child support payments, averaging about $100 per year, results in a decrease in screened-in child maltreatment reports. We see that material hardship is a consistent predictor of CPS contact. Income poverty and material hardship are associated with higher odds of a self-reported CPS contact, and unmet basic needs pose a remarkably consistent risk for CPS contact over and above income poverty. So what does that look like upstream of child welfare? This is a study looking at low-income families that were receiving TANF, temporary assistance to needy families. And if they experience one material hardship, their risk for an investigation goes up, both for neglect and for physical abuse. But if they experience multiple material hardships after experiencing no material hardships, their likelihood of a CPS investigation jumps by 4 times. And there is a 7 times, that is an enormous effect, 7 times higher likelihood of a physical abuse investigation. So there's something happening about these material shocks. And I think earnings or income shocks are having a particular effect, because once families have an investigation, right? We were just looking at before an investigation and the likely it could increase of an investigation. This is families who've had a closed investigation. And if they experience a negative earning shock, and it was defined as about a loss of income during a quarter of 30% or more, look at that increase in a risk of a subsequent CPS investigation and a 20% increase in a risk of a physical abuse investigation. But again, benefits can be really buffering. Each consecutive quarter, when stable income is occurring, there's a 5% lower risk of CPS investigation, and accessing public benefits when these earning shocks occur effectively buffers the risk of child welfare system involvement. And look at that decrease in risk for physical abuse for young children between the ages of 0 and 4. So I've mostly been talking about before kids come into foster care, but you'll remember in that slide I showed you across child welfare outcomes and across child maltreatment types, this looks at reunification and time in foster care. So we see this effect here. Every reunification rates are lower for families who become more economically disadvantaged following a child welfare system involvement, while rates are higher among those who maintain or gain economic connections. And every $100 increase in a mother's post-placement income increases the speed of reunification by 6%. Actually, I'm going to go back one. When families are required, or there's a child support order for the cost of foster care, a $100 increase in that child support order amounted to a prediction in delayed reunification by 6.5 months. It's a really long time in the life of a child. So if parenting is a public health issue, and the Surgeon General tells us that stressors related to child caregiving can also be disproportionately burdened among some parents and caregivers, notably those with fewer resources and those who experience economic, social, political, and cultural marginalization, then we really should be thinking about an economic, macroeconomic set of strategies or a public health set of strategies to addressing this challenge. And here we see the National Academies of Sciences back in 2019 creating a roadmap for reducing child poverty. And they created 4 policy packages to see which of them might reduce child poverty. And you see 3 of the 4 packages there. So sort of this bundling of policies at the macroeconomic level, really at a public health that would be distributed in a public health way, sort of universally, or in ways that get these resources to the families who need them the most. And Jessica Pack and her colleagues in 2023, last year, took those packages and linked those packages with CPS investigative data and found that depending on the package that you chose, CPS investigations might be reduced by 11 to 20%. And that's a little over 650,000 kids potentially who would not experience an investigation per year. That analysis also suggested that implementation of 1 or more of these packages could substantially reduce racial disproportionality, because that 11 to 20% jumps to 19 to 29% reduction in investigations for Black children. But we'll look a little bit later at what happens when we actually model real data with state spending. It looks a little bit different than this. Okay, I've been sort of working up to this slide for the first quarter of the presentation. We spend a lot of time over the last 50 years, and one could argue for the last 500 years, beginning with the codification of an understanding of the deserving or undeserving poor in the Elizabethan Poor Laws, interrogating the choices that people make that place themselves into context in which risk is elevated or safety concerns arise. On the left-hand side, we see a comparison of our actuarial tools to our consensus-based assessment tools, where we are fundamentally interrogating choices and context that we perceive that families are created. I think the evidence at this point encourages us to interrogate our policy choices in similar ways. Chapin Hall with the American Public Human Services Association has created a tool to help us analyze policies at the state level relative to evidence. So we've taken many of the studies that I'm sharing with you today and included them in this tool alongside the choices that states have relative to that evidence. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick sip of water, and we're going to change gears to look at more specifically in depth what some of the studies say about increasing or decreasing economic and concrete supports and the effect it has in the lives of families. It's important for me to first say that we're going to look at a lot of different kinds of studies. I previewed this when we started. We have some small number of randomized controlled trials. We have natural experiments. We have decades of administrative data. We have theoretical models. I would argue that this is a preponderance of evidence that helps us inform our hypotheses and the policy actions that we take. So we're going to look now at what happens when economic and concrete supports are decreased. And we're going to look at reduced temporary assistance to needy families benefits, lack of access to childcare, and lack of stable housing. There are also studies, so that we're not going to look at them today, about reduced income and negative earning shocks, although we've already looked at one of those studies, reduced employment, increased gas prices, and increased regressive taxes all have a relationship with increased risk for child welfare system involvement. So let's look at TANF first. I'm first going to tell you, if you don't know, that the first statutory purpose of TANF is to, quote, provide assistance to needy families so that children can be cared for at home or with relatives. So our decision-making in TANF should ensure that kids can be cared for at home or with relatives. And we see that states that impose a total benefit loss for the most severe sanction for not meeting TANF work requirements actually have kids being removed from home. We see about a 13% increase in foster care entries due to neglect and a little over 12.5% increase in total foster care entries. This research team of Ginther and Johnson-Motoyama reanalyzed that data from the study I just showed you in 2022 and looked at it by policy choices inside of TANF. And they found that for each additional policy choice a state makes that restricts access to TANF is associated with 22 additional children per 100,000 children entering foster care due to abuse and 21 entering foster care due to neglect. So what's the state policy option? States can choose whether or not to institute full family sanctions for non-compliance with TANF work compliance. All right, let's look at lack of access to childcare subsidies. So states that have more restrictive childcare subsidy enrollment policies are associated with higher rates of substantiated child maltreatment reports. And those restrictions include applying asset tests to determine eligibility and counting more benefits as income in determining eligibility for childcare. This second bullet is actually one of my favorites. This is a qualitative study that looked at moms who were entering substance abuse treatment. And the moms that reported difficulty finding childcare were 82% more likely to self-report child neglect compared to the moms who were entering substance abuse treatment who did not report childcare difficulties. And difficulty finding childcare was a stronger predictor of maternal neglect than almost any other factor in this study, including mental health and severity of drug use. And I think one of the reasons that it's most fun for me here, or most intriguing, is that we typically have thought very linearly about how to solve a problem. If we have a substance abuse problem, the treatment, the solution is a substance abuse treatment program. And that absolutely can be the case. But I think we've not thought about synergistic policies and how they operate together to support parents. That childcare might be, at least for these moms, the deciding factor in the neglect of their child over and above the substance use. Reduced employment. During the Great Recession between 2007 and 2009, the rates of abusive head trauma were, for kids under the age of 5, were considerably higher than during the period immediately before. And housing stress. And we see across almost all kinds of housing stress. Homelessness, eviction, foreclosure, just instability and inadequate housing is associated with an increased likelihood of child welfare system involvement across self-reports, investigations, substantiations, and foster care placements. And this isn't just the families who can't afford rent. This is also families who have had enough resources to purchase a home. So we see that increased mortgage delinquencies and foreclosure rates are associated with hospital admissions for physical abuse of young children and traumatic brain injury for infants under the age of 1. Okay, we're going to look at the converse now. So what happens when we increase economic and concrete supports? Again, through a variety of mechanisms. We see that when families have sufficient concrete supports, able to meet their basic needs, have access to childcare and educational opportunities and housing, you're better positioned to provide nurturing, responsive parenting, focus in on well-being, and reduced risk for child welfare system involvement. So we see studies, and we've just categorized them in these 4 buckets to help us understand this whole of macroeconomic policy, whole of government, whole of child welfare pathway forward. Our macroeconomic supports, concrete supports, public benefits, and child welfare interventions with economic and concrete supports, all I'm going to show you have decreased risk for child welfare system involvement. So again, I think I'm encouraging us when we talk about child welfare transformation to talk about it in a much broader way, that we're actually, maybe we are talking about child welfare transformation, but we're talking about a much larger transformation here. And we'll show you a visual infographic about that at the end. Okay, let's look at cash. The Alaska Dividend Program provides funds to the populace based on oil and gas revenue. And this working paper, one of the only working papers I think that I'm showing you today, found that $1,000 in unconditional cash payments to families in the early months of a child's life is estimated to reduce CPS referrals for neglect by about 10%, reduce the likelihood of CPS referral for physical abuse by 30%, reduce substantiations, and reduce child mortality by 30%. And in this instance, they estimated that that would be 3 fewer deaths for a state that, for Alaska, who would have about 9 fatalities total. Earned income tax credit. So cash, this is also a cash strategy in the form of tax credits. EITC and CTC are associated with immediate reductions in state level child maltreatment reports, and each additional $1,000 per child in a CTC refund is associated with a decline in state level child maltreatment reports initially and 4 weeks after the payment. Here we see states that have a refundable EITC compared to those without is associated with an 11% decrease in foster care admissions. I don't know a single child welfare administrator out there who would not take an 11% decrease in foster care entries for kids who do not need to be in foster care. And if states had, without any EITC, had implemented a refundable EITC, an average of 668 fewer children would enter foster care annually in each state. So what's a policy option? States can implement more generous child tax credits and holistic response and supports for families, and we see Minnesota doing that by establishing a nation-leading child tax credit, which provides up to $1,750 per child for low-income families, and is expected to cut child poverty by 33%. States could also establish a child tax credit, and we see that many states have not. Minimum wage. This is actually the very first study I saw, and I didn't believe it. It ran against my mental model of the nature of the problem and the set of solutions for problems. So I always really love elevating this study that shows us that states that increased the minimum wage beyond $7.25 per hour experienced a decline in child maltreatment reports, and every $1 increase in the minimum wage was associated with about a 10% decline in neglect reports.
Claire, there's a question about the Alaska study. Is the Alaska study indicating a one-time $1,000 cash grant or a monthly payment of $1,000?
Yeah, so it's my understanding that those payments come on an annual basis, but that study looks specifically at that $1,000 payment landing in the first 3 months of a child's life.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So what's a policy option regarding minimum wage? States have the option to increase their minimum wage. And about 18 states plus the District of Columbia, when this graphic was created, had done so. Let's look at paid family leave. Compared to states with no paid family leave, The implementation of California's paid family leave, which offered up to 12 weeks of partial pay, was associated with a decrease in hospital admissions for abusive head trauma. And compared to states with no paid family leave, states that enacted paid family leave policy, so several states here, were associated with reduced infant maltreatment rates, and seem to be especially protective for infants in states with high levels of family poverty and adults without a high school education. So what's the state policy option? These are choices. States can implement paid family leave. We see 13 states and DC have adopted statewide paid family leave. And we see Puerto Rico, Nevada, and Oklahoma, I think North Carolina, beginning to implement paid family leave for certain employees, like state employees or for teachers. Okay, Medicaid expansion. We see that the rate of screened-in neglect reports for kids under the age of 6 decreased in states that expanded Medicaid, but increased in states that did not. And what's the state policy option for using Medicaid? We see states beginning to ask for waivers that allow them to finance social determinants of health strategies like housing, food, transportation using Medicaid dollars. Oregon, for example, has created categorical eligibility and consistent eligibility for children through age 6. So really sort of new thinking about what can our various funding streams like Medicaid, temporary assistance for needy families, and our 4E child welfare funding stream, being really thoughtful about and innovative about what could be covered to address these more challenging downstream problems. Childcare subsidies. So let's look at childcare. We looked previously at what happens when states have restrictive childcare policies, but states with more generous income eligibility have lower physical abuse and neglect investigation rates among young children. Let's just look at what one choice might look like and the effect it could have. If Michigan had increased its maximum monthly enrollment by $700 for a family of 3, we might see 528 fewer kids under the age of 5 investigated for physical abuse, and about 1,200 kids under the age of 5 investigated for neglect. This is a little modeling study that looked at the Build Back Better executive branch proposal that included funding for childcare investments, which were quite generous. And we found, Hank Poles and Paul Chung and I, that the investments in Build Back Better might be associated with a 6% reduction in substantiations, a 3% reduction in foster care placements, and about a 12% reduction in fatalities. So states can make childcare more affordable and can expand access. And we also see in housing, this is a randomized controlled trial. The Family Options Study found that homeless families that received a permanent housing subsidy reported 50% fewer foster care placements. States are beginning to include short-term housing supports to families that are involved in child welfare. And we see the Family Keys program in Wisconsin doing that. And in Connecticut, the Head Start program on housing provides federal housing vouchers to families with young children in Head Start programs. Expanding TANF, making more accessible and less restrictive TANF benefits was associated with reductions in neglect and fewer foster care placements. And I'm going to skip that one. States have the option to increase cash benefits in TANF. And we see California adding TANF funds to its home visiting program and increasing the amount of available funds. And we see Missouri noting that families that received TANF before they were reported are twice as likely to experience an investigation and have their kids placed in foster care. And so they're creating a navigation program to more benefits to help support and stabilize families. We see this effect in SNAP, so stabilizing food insecurity. More generous SNAP policies are associated with fewer foster care placements, and estimated reductions in CPS reports and substantiations were particularly large among states offering transitional SNAP benefits to families leaving TANF. We can make choices to reduce administrative burden for accessing and participating in SNAP. And we also now get to child welfare interventions that also include economic and concrete supports. And families with open child welfare cases, mostly neglect, who receive a home-based service that includes concrete supports, were 17% less likely to experience a subsequent child maltreatment report during the first year. And families who report difficulty paying for bills prior to receiving a home-based family preservation that includes concrete supports, when we provide in that context clothing, furniture, supplies, or housing assistance, we see reduced likelihood of a substantiated maltreatment report and reduced likelihood of subsequent foster care placement. We see several states making funds available for concrete supports when families are known to child welfare. In Illinois, that's called the Norman Fund. In Kentucky, they've made flexible funds available, and families that are receiving the in-home family preservation program there are eligible for up to about $5,500 in funds to meet concrete needs. And so I'm going to skip this next section, although I'll make 1 or 2 points and then close it out to make sure that we have a little bit of time to talk about questions. We do understand that mental health and substance abuse and other challenges in families elevate risk for a report, a substantiation, and entry into foster care, and all types of maltreatment. We rarely talk about material hardship is associated with and can precede poor mental health. And among low-income mothers with a young child, experiencing material hardship in the last 12 months is associated with an increased risk of depression. So when we're talking about the nature of the problem we're trying to solve, I think we have to look to some of our root causes and and addressing those in addition to what is most proximal in front of us. I'm going to skip these and just say that if we are going to look to a set of solutions, one of them is looking at windfalls in states. And over the course of my career, there have now been 3 windfalls that states have experienced: the tobacco settlements, the COVID relief funds, and now the opioid settlements. And how states make decisions and choices about where and how to use those dollars is really important. And I think a particularly interesting question at this very moment is, how are your states planning on spending the opioid settlement dollars? And this evidence and what we know about how and why families come to the attention of child welfare, I think is an easy case to make that much of those dollars could and should be spent in the prevention space. I'm going to go back for a minute to this uncoupling or coupling economic supports with social supports. And if we look at state spending as on its own, this study found that in 2017, if all states had increased investment in their public benefit program, so really sort of this public health approach, by 13%, there would have been an estimated fewer 180,000 reports, 28,000 fewer substantiations, 4,000 fewer foster care placements, and an estimated 130 fewer child fatalities due to maltreatment. But these researchers also caution us. Oh, and of course, I'm having a little bit of a difficulty here. They caution us that, wait, there we go. That when you actually model state spending data in real time, that the more states spend across this benefit platform, that white children tend to benefit the most in terms of reduced CPS investigation. So being really mindful about access to benefits as we are trying to solve this problem. States have a lot of choice in how much they spend in its benefit platform and its mix of spending. And so this is also a place to begin to look and think with your state about where and how resources are best used. It's important when you do that to understand that the U.S. provides less aid to families with children as a share of GDP than almost all of the other developed countries. And when we don't solve for child maltreatment and involvement with child welfare, it is extraordinarily expensive. The bullet at the bottom looked at the economic lifetime burden associated with investigated cases of child maltreatment. It took the 2018 cohort and estimated what the economic burden would be across their lifetime. And it comes up to a high staggering $2.94 trillion. My home state of Alabama did an analysis to look at the economic burden to it as a state. It's actually a relatively small state, and found that across all of its productivity, juvenile justice, mental health, that the burden would be about $3.7 billion per year to its economy. We see in one study a negative return on investment for foster care. Every $1 spent on foster care is estimated to have a negative social return of up to $9.50. And we spend very little of our child welfare dollars. And I know I've been talking a lot about all of our dollars, but when we look very specifically at child welfare dollars, we've spent a very limited amount, even though Family First allows us now to spend in the prevention space on prevention relative to foster care and relative to adoption and guardianship. So what does this all look like rolled up into one infographic? When families become overloaded, there are a set of evidence-based macroeconomic policies, concrete supports, public benefits, and strategies that can ensure that that we are taking a holistic approach in our efforts to prevent maltreatment and involvement with child welfare, so that the activation and deployment of child protective services and the use of foster care becomes used when we need it most for kids who are not safe and whose safety is endangered. So thank you very much. I'm very grateful for having had the opportunity to talk with you today and to think a little bit more deeply with you about how do we use evidence to uncouple poverty, neglect, and abuse, involvement with child welfare, and how to address the long-standing uncoupling of economic and concrete supports from our social supports in our policy framework.
Thank you, Claire. There is one more question. I think it was earlier on in your presentation. I just missed it. The question is, increased ECS reduces physical abuse alone or physical and sexual abuse?
That's a great question. We don't have a lot of data on sexual abuse specifically. I do know that in the Hank Pulls analysis, there is a very small finding around reduction of sex abuse. So I don't have a lot that I can point to specifically. And I don't know that in some of the studies that talk about abuse, that they are disaggregating physical abuse from sex abuse. But it's a great question. I think we need to continue to explore that. I certainly have a hypothesis that's rooted or grounded in the first 10 years of my career, which was on the child protection team at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C., that increased access to childcare would likely have an effect on reduced sex abuse, given that we often, or we can see sex abuse in the context of inappropriate caregivers or parents needing to leave their kids with others. So it's a great question, and I think we need to know much more.
Lovely comments in the chat. Is it possible to get the slides? Yes, we will upload them into the portal so people can get that. Where can you find the last slide of the infogram of what you covered overall? So that'll be in your slide deck, correct?
That's right.
We also have that on the website too, right?
That's right. It's on the website, and I can drop that into the chat if it would be helpful.
Thank you.
Let me just get that up for us.
There are people who want you to come to their state houses, Claire. I think every governor should listen to you and and what you and your team have summarized.
I appreciate that very much. I am happy to do so. I mean this sort of tongue in cheek, but it's actually quite true. To having gone from not believing the first study that I saw, to having this evidence take over my life, has been a journey, and I'm happy to share it with others so that they too can have the opportunity to interrogate the evidence and make meaning of it in a way that is most useful to them.
You know, it's a provocative question, and I'm not sure you have an answer to it, but I would be interested in you opining on it. With so much evidence supporting material support to families, why is child welfare system not ready to change?
That's a great question, and I would frame it a little differently. Why don't we have the policy context? We just conducted, and I'll see if I can't find that here, a survey of child welfare leaders, asking them about economic hardship and instability as a factor, and the extent to which they believed that economic and concrete supports would help to mitigate. By and large, child welfare leaders affirm this is a course of action. They feel challenged by not having the resources available to them, not having the policy clearly defined that they can use their funding stream for these economic and concrete supports. And they feel challenged to activate the upstream funding streams like Medicaid and TANF to be able to address family needs in the gap. So I actually have, through this journey, come to understand even that question very differently than I did a year or two ago.
Thank you, Claire. I know there's one other question that I think Josh popped into the chat.
And I don't see it yet. Oh, there we go. What'd you say? The first one's a great question. I think about it all the time. I tend to not think about policies as failures because I always think there are opportunities and challenges in every single policy. Family First has certainly expanded our ability to resource prevention services. And we've seen enormous innovation on the part of states to try and leverage it to meet families where they are with the resources that they need. I absolutely believe that there are some fundamental things in Family First that make it difficult that would be worth changing. Candidate for foster care, imminent risk for entry into foster care, and if not for this service, the plan for your child is foster care, are completely misaligned with a prevention framework. And it is the Family First Prevention Services Act. Would you support child welfare agencies providing daycare services to families who are being investigated or non-court involved to avoid? So I want to point you to the new policy guidance in the Child Welfare Policy Manual at 8.6C on administrative costs in Family First Prevention Services, 4E Prevention Services, and it identifies childcare as a allowable administrative cost to increase access to Family First services. And I think states are beginning to try and understand what that means for them. And if we could eliminate poverty, what's your best guess? I stay up at night on question 3. I think it's impossible to say. I don't know the answer to that. But I also know that many of the solutions that we've been pursuing for decades haven't eliminated the problem either. And so I think that we have to have a nuanced way of thinking about this. We have no evidence that eliminating poverty eliminates child abuse and neglect. But we do have ample evidence that we know enough to use it as part of our toolkit and to increase financial stability and access to resources to families.
What a way to end, Claire. Thank you. Excellent presentation, tons of love in the chat. Great appreciation for you and your team and this. I'd like to just be like one little thing in your brain, because holy cow, you contain so many studies up there that you are rattling off and seaming together and portraying and giving people a portrait and a lot of things to think about around how policies can really change the lives of children and families. So thank you so very much. And we look forward to watching the Chapin Hall space and seeing what you and your team continue to develop.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to continuing to interrogate the policy choices and the evidence to try and come up with something that is responsive to what families say they need and has likelihood of success in supporting families and reducing child maltreatment and involvement with child welfare. So I'm just incredibly grateful for the kinds of spaces that you're creating to do just that, to challenge all of us and all of our thinking to find a way forward.
Thanks, Claire. Be well. Thank you everyone for joining, and remember to fill out the survey.